Welcome back again. We'll start with, after tea, we have Dr. Namrata Sharma from Delhi. She is an internationally known figure in cornea, cataract and refractive surgery. So we are glad to have her here. All of us will benefit from her experience. She'll be talking to us about keratoconus. She's an additional professor at the RP Center, Institute for Medical Sciences. Namrata, please.
Thank you. I would be talking to you about keratoconus. It's a huge topic actually, and to cover it in half an hour is a little difficult.
You have 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you for that. If you see the epidemiology, the incidence is 1 in 2,000. Presents as a non-inflammatory corneal ectasia, generally bilateral in 90% of the cases, asymmetrical, starts in teens and progresses till 40s. This is important because when you are doing a treatment such as collagen cross-linking, you need to know the age of the patient, because you know that if he comes to you in the age of 40, he probably doesn't need it because it's not going to progress. So one has to know the age. That's why it becomes important. It is generally seen as an isolated disease. There is no sex preponderance, and 6 to 8% have positive family history. Although most cases are idiopathic, but there is a combined genetic, biochemical, biomechanical factors which play an important role. 6 to 8% of the subjects with keratoconus had affected relatives as per the various studies, and 19 pairs of monozygotic twins were affected with keratoconus. Several loci have been associated when the genes were mapped, but there are no mutations in any genes which are consistently associated with keratoconus. If you see the biochemical factors, there is excessive degradation of stroma by the proteolytic enzymes because of increased proteases and other catabolic enzymes, and decreased proteinase inhibitors like 2-macroglobulin and 1-antiprotease. The most important biochemical factor here to know is about interleukin-1. Keratocytes in keratoconus have 4 times interleukin-1 compared to the normal subjects. And interleukin-1 is the modulator of keratocyte proliferation, differentiation, and death. There are various associations of keratoconus which could be systemic or ocular. Systemic associations include Down syndrome, atrophy, mitral valve prolapse, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, Turner's, Marfan's, and Apert syndrome. Apart from this, the ocular associations include vernal catarrh, Leber's hereditary amaurosis, retinitis pigmentosa, eye rubbing, aniridia, blue sclera, and ectopia lentis. Now, when you make a diagnosis of keratoconus, it is based on 2 features. One is the clinical diagnosis, and other the investigations. In the early disease, when the patient may be asymptomatic, may be just wearing glasses. The only sign may be inability to refract to a crisp 6x6. In the advanced cases, however, there may be significant distortion of vision with decrease in vision. And if it is associated with vernal catarrh, which then becomes a secondary keratoconus and which is quite common in our country, there would be associated itching, redness, and watering. So if you see in the early disease, there is scissoring on retinoscopy. And if you do a retroillumination, there is an oil droplet sign which is present, which is shown in the picture. Again, in the early disease, because of the steep corneal curvature, there is the presence of Fleischer's ring, which comes at the level of the epithelium because of the disturbed tear film dynamics. The Fleischer's ring you can see as a yellowish line when you do a diffuse slit lamp examination, and under a cobalt blue filter, it can be picked up in the earliest of the stages, and it appears like a bluish line. Apart from this, you can see prominent corneal nerves, such as seen in these photographs, which are also present in several other conditions apart from keratoconus. Then there are Vogt stria present, which are classically vertical stria because of the ruptures which are present in the Bowman's membrane, and they can be very well seen when you do a slit lamp examination, especially when you make a slit. Advanced cases elicit Rizzuti phenomena, Munson sign, and there may be severe thinning with scarring. These are the advanced cases. In the Munson sign, when you ask the patient to look down, there is lid notching as seen in the picture on your right. And in the Rizzuti's phenomena, when you show the light from the temporal side, it reflects very brightly onto the nasal side because of steep corneal curvature and because of AC depth which is increased, and this is called as the Rizzuti phenomena. Again, these are advanced cases with severe corneal ectasia, and In very advanced cases, if there has been acute eye drops which has healed, then it may even lead to corneal scarring. Whenever corneal scarring is present in case of keratoconus, you should try to see at what level it is. It may be subepithelial, it may be epithelial, or it may be at the level of the Descemet's membrane. So if it is epithelial or subepithelial, probably it is not that advanced a case, but if it is at the level of the Descemet's membrane due to healed eye drops, that means it's advanced keratoconus. The differential diagnosis consists of other ectasias, which include pellucid marginal degeneration such as this, which again is bilateral, may be asymmetric. There is a 1 to 2 millimeter uninvolved area of normal cornea near the limbus. And there is a peripheral band of thinning which is present inferiorly, which is most marked from 4 to 8 o'clock zone, but the central cornea may appear to be normal in the early cases. If you do a video keratography, I'll show you the pictures later, you can see a classical butterfly appearance of against the rule astigmatism. The keratoglobus, the cornea appears to be globular in shape. It is again present from birth, autosomal recessive, bilateral. The entire cornea is thinned out most markedly near the limbus, so there is thinning which is present from limbus to limbus. And it is often associated with blue sclera and other systemic features, and they are prone to corneal rupture even from minimal trauma. That is why in case of keratoglobus, you do require some form of a lamellar keratoplasty to be done to reinforce the thinned out area which is present in the periphery. Just notice these two pictures. These are globular corneas, or what we called as keratoglobus. I think we have already talked about it, but just to recapitulate, keratoconus is most common out of the corneal ectasias listed here, usually bilateral, almost all of them are bilateral. Age of onset, keratoconus is at puberty, PMD is 20 to 40 years, and keratoglobus is at birth. Thinning, inferior and paracentrally. In PMD, it is inferior band, which is 1 to 2 millimeters wide, and keratoglobus, it is generally at the periphery. If you see the protrusion, it is thinnest at the apex in the keratoconus. It is superior to band of thinning in pellucid, whereas it is generalized circumferentially 360 degrees in keratoglobus. An iron line may be present with keratoconus and pellucid, but it is rare to see with the keratoglobus. And scarring may be present after eye drops. Stria are generally common in keratoconus and sometimes may be there in pellucid and keratoglobus. A word about Tyrrell's marginal degeneration. It occurs in the older age group. It affects both superior and inferior cornea. It is accompanied by lipid deposition and vascular invasion. So you can very clearly differentiate it from other kind of ectasias. Coming to entity acute eye drops, which can be there in keratoconus, it can be there in pellucid, it can be also there in keratoglobus. It is generally a feature of advanced disease. There is sudden onset pain, diminution of vision, conjunctival injection, corneal edema, and it mainly occurs because of excessive steepening. There are ruptures which are present in the Descemet's membrane, so the aqueous seeps into the corneal stroma and causes corneal edema. The medical therapy for this condition consists of patching, hypertonic saline, topical steroids, cycloplegics, and anti-glaucoma therapy. And the surgical therapy, people have used intracameral air, SF6, and C3F8 in the anterior chamber in order to tamponade the tear which is present in the Descemet's membrane. And all that it does is that it hastens the healing that would occur. Otherwise, also, if you just treat the patient conventionally. In very large acute eye drops, you may have to do penetrating keratoplasty. This is one case of acute eye drops wherein C3F8 was injected and it healed the disease entity, and resolution of the edema and pain both occur with scarring, and this also flattens the corneal surface. So the vision may slightly improve post-operatively, and the contact lens fitting may also become better because now it's a relatively flatter cornea as compared to pre-acute eye drops. Coming to the investigations, keratometry is a crude investigation for keratoconus, but when you're refracting the patient and the patient doesn't improve, then it does help you in suspecting keratoconus. Apart from this, the mainstay is corneal topography with video keratography, OpScan or Pentacam, whatever is available. Corneal thickness is very important. The ultrasonic corneal thickness using the an ultrasonic pachymetry is the gold standard, but it can be assessed also by OpScan, Pentacam, and anterior segment OCT, and we also do axial length in these cases. Now, if you see the video keratography map, I think all of us are familiar with the basics. The steeper areas are seen as red in color or hot colors, and the flatter areas are actually the bluish or the cool colors. In video keratography is a Placido disc base which provides a surface maps, and you see this classical asymmetrical picture wherein the area of the cone is depicted by the red area. This is the OPSCAN 4-quad map, which again by the classical red hotspot which is present in the center, you know that there is presence of keratoconus. It works on the slit scanning mechanism, and the details of this are actually beyond the scope of the lecture today, but corneal topography is another lecture in itself which can be taken later. If you see the Pentachem, which is the latest tool in corneal topography, it gives you the standard map, which is the top one, the enhanced map, that is, this particular map is only mapping the cone area, and then the last one is the difference between the standard map and the cone map. So this map and this map becomes important. And if you see the red area in these maps, that means there is presence of keratoconus. Now, just to show that sometimes astigmatism may be present, and then that should not be confused with keratoconus. In astigmatism, the two red hot areas are symmetrically, diagrammatically opposite to each other, and it is different from how a keratoconus looks like. Notice keratoconus, which is asymmetrical and present inferiorly in this case. In keratoglobus, you would have marked corneal thinning all around and steepening of the entire cornea right from the center to the periphery. Coming to the classification of keratoconus, it can be classified on various ways. The nipple, the oval, and the globus variety. This is more for the contact lens specialist. Contact lens correction is easier in the nipple cone, which is less than 5 millimeters. If it is more than 5 millimeters, paracentral to peripheral, then it is an oval cone. It becomes difficult to fit the contact lens. And the globus variety, where the cone is more than 75% of the cornea, contact lens fitting is extremely difficult. Again, based on the curvature of the cornea, it is mild, less than 45, moderate, 45 to 52, advanced, more than 52, and severe, more than 62. Now, this is the classification that we generally tend to follow, the Amsler-Krumish classification, where stage 1 is eccentric corneal bulge with myopia or astigmatism less than 5 diopters with radius of curvature less than 48, presence of Vogt stria but no corneal opacities. Stage 2 is between 5 and 8, radius of curvature between 48 and 53, pachymetry more than 400 microns and no opacities. Stage 3 is more than 8 diopters and less than 5 diopters, corneal radius of curvature more than 53 diopters, no corneal opacities, and pachymetry, which is less, that is more than 200 but less than 400. And in stage 4, refraction is not possible. The radius of curvature is more than 55 and pachymetry is less than 200 microns with central scars. Again, there are various index-based systems for keratoconus detection, which were given over the various years, which generally are not followed. This is the severity grading of Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary criteria, which we follow in our refractive surgery unit when we want to rule out a keratoconus suspect, because you should not do refractive surgery in a patient of keratoconus suspect. And this takes into account the keratometric difference between both the eyes, less than 1.9 and more than 1.9, 0 and 1 score. The keratometry absolute in both the eyes again, and we again score it from 0 to 2, and inferior superior asymmetry in the 3 millimeter zone, and again less than 1.4 is 0, 1.4 to 1.9 is 1, and more than 1.9 is 2. Now, based on this, we calculate a cumulative score, and if it is 0, then it is normal. If it is 1 to 3, then it is suspect. And if it is 4 to 5, then it is early, and 6 to 9 advanced. And this has stood by us for almost now 14 years, ever since we started doing LASIK, and to rule out the keratoconus suspect, and it is quite good. Now, this slide essentially tells you about the management of keratoconus. This was a review article published by us in British Journal of Ophthalmology, and if you read this, you would know how to you would know at one place only what to do when. In the early stages of keratoconus, you start with the spectacles. If they do not improve, then go to contact lens. People have done toric intraocular lenses as well as Intacs. People have combined treatments as well. Cross-linking is done to decrease the progression of keratoconus. And keratoplasty is essentially decided by what is the corneal thickness. So if it is more than 380 microns, we would do an automated lamellar therapeutic keratoplasty or a deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. If it is less than 380 microns, there are increased chances of perforation, so we would do a deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. If there's associated peripheral thinning, then you have to address the periphery. So you do a tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty, and in cases of healed hair drops with corneal scars, you do a penetrating keratoplasty. So spectacles may suffice in early cases, and contact lens may be needed later. The most commonly material used here is the RGP contact lens, or the rigid gas permeable, which is made out of PMMA. The fitting strategy in these cases is that there should be a 3-point touch. That is, the apical touch should be there in the center, and then there should be a light touch on the apex and heavier touch on the paracentral cornea. So you say that the contact lens fitting is optimal. Apart from this, because a hard contact lens may not be tolerated by everybody for prolonged hours, so piggyback systems and hybrid contact lenses have come, and they have a rigid center and soft periphery. So the rigid center corrects the irregular astigmatism in the center, and the soft periphery is for the comfort. And the latest in the armamentarium of contact lenses is the Rose K lens, which is, you can say, like a tailored contact lens. So whatever the cone is, whatever the curvature is, the lens would be tailored according to that. And the two lenses that we use most commonly are the Rose K True and the Rose K IC. This diagram tells you the difference between a standard lens. A standard lens, which has a fixed optic zone, will have unwanted pooling at the base of the cone and peripheral bearing that can seal off and cause corneal problems. So you can say that there's a gap which is present and causes a deep pool. But a Rose K lens exactly fits onto the cone that is there and is tailored so that there's even distribution of tears under the lens. Coming to the next modality of treatment, that is the intracorneal ring segments. These are the segments. These are semicircular segments which are inserted inside the cornea. They act by the arc shortening effect on the corneal lamellae, and they flatten the central cornea. They can only they are only used in mild to moderate cases of keratoconus, and those cases where there is contact lens intolerance. They are of two types: the Intacs, which are hexagonal cross section and placed more peripherally, and the Ferrara rings, which are triangular, prismatic in shape and placed more centrally. Now, this is essentially the principle. That is, you're trying to flatten the central part by putting these two rings so that the center it becomes flatter and is no longer steeper. The advantage is it is reversible. You can take it out. The advantage is it is an additive procedure. It is not subtracting the cornea, which is already thinned out. It does not affect the central corneal visual acuity. There is a technique to do it. You can use both the intralamellar pockets as well as femtosecond, but there are disadvantages in the form of extrusion of the Intacs, infection which can occur. Sometimes it may go into the anterior chamber. There may be opacification of the Intacs. And it can be also combined with other procedures such as PRK, phakic intraocular lenses, and collagen cross-linking. Now, this is a video just to show how Intacs are done. The center of the cornea is marked first, and this is followed by making a mark for the two Intacs. This is the diamond blade which is being used to 2 mm incision is made. And there's a microkeratome which is specially designed for this. This basically has two lamellar dissectors which are again semicircular in shape. And these two channels are made with the help of these lamellar dissectors, or they can be also made with the help of femtosecond. If femtosecond laser is available. And after making these, the PMMA intracorneal ring segments are taken and then they are inserted into these channels. So this essentially causes the flattening of the central part of the steep cornea, or the central part where the curvature is steep. The next procedure that we come to is the corneal collagen cross-linking. Cross-linking uses riboflavin as well as UV radiation. It halts and stabilizes keratoconus, and UVA radiation generates the reactive oxygen species, which induces the covalent bonds between the collagen fibrils in the stroma. So it makes the cornea a little more stiffer than what it is before. In corneal thickness less than 400 microns or less than 350 microns, you should not do this procedure because it may then impinge on the endothelium. And this is how it is done. This is just a trephine to mark the area from wherein the epithelial debridement would be done. The epithelial debridement is done, followed by the riboflavin drops, which are instilled after every 5 minutes for half an hour. And then one sees whether they are present in the anterior chamber or not. And after 30 minutes, UV radiation is done with this instrument, again for 30 minutes. And following this, a bandage contact lens is placed. Coming to the... Okay. Coming to the keratoplasty in keratoconus, we do prefer to do a lamellar graft in cases of keratoconus now because it's extraocular, because chances of rejection are less. The graft survival is better, the wound healing is faster. You need to give less post-op steroids. The post-op care is so easier. And although the final refractive error or final vision may be less crisp as compared to penetrating keratoplasty, but due to the presence of interface scarring in these cases, but that's a trade-off. But the quality of the donor cornea that is required is not that stringent, and it makes especially relevant in country like ours where there's paucity of good quality donor material. However, if there's a scar present due to healed eye drops, you have to do a penetrating keratoplasty. Now, the first technique is the automated lamellar therapeutic keratoplasty, which uses an automated microkeratome system to cut the donor and the recipient both. And because it is an automated system and not a manual system, you have smooth graft-host interface. There is less interface scarring. The operative time is less. The skills are required less. And the limitations are that it is machine-dependent and it cannot be undertaken in thin corneas and also in cases where there is deep scarring. You cannot do it if it is more than 380 microns because of the chances of perforation. Now, this is how the donor corneoscleral rim is put on the microkeratome, on the anterior chamber assembly system. And just like in LASIK, similarly, you cut the donor button. This is 350 microkeratome which is being used. So we are taking the anterior part of the cornea, which is 350 microns. And herein, this is the recipient, wherein keratoconus is present, and this is again a suction ring which is being placed, and microkeratome is being used to again remove. We normally remove 250 microns from the host and use 350 microns for the donor, and the donor button that you had previously dissected is then taken, and you use the same size graft, or you use the same size graft and then you suture it with tight 10-0 monofilament nylon sutures so that you flatten the cone. The second technique is the deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. If you want to go still deeper than the ALTK procedure, which can be done by air injection, hydrodelamination, viscodissection, and more lately 2 techniques have come up, that is the big bubble technique and the double bubble technique. With the big bubble and the double bubble, you can go right up to the Descemet's membrane, which may not be possible with the other techniques where you are at the level of the near Descemet's membrane. The advantages of reaching right up to the Descemet's membrane is that you have better visual outcome. And the limitation or the problems are that there is a chance of perforation because you are very close to the Descemet's membrane, 5 to 30%, and especially if the corneal thickness is less than 250 microns. And this technique does have a steep learning curve when you go right up to the Descemet's membrane, especially the big bubble and the double bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. Now, the first, one of the most popular techniques of deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty is by the Mally's technique. You inject air bubble inside the anterior chamber, then a scleral groove is made, and then a lamellar dissector is taken, and lamellar dissection is done from limbus to limbus. This is followed by viscoelastic injection, and all this is happening at a depth of 400 microns, because the initial incision that you make with the blade, blade is at 400 microns. Now, after doing this, injecting the viscoelastic, the anterior lamellar button, which is nearly 400 microns in thickness, is then dissected. And so you do reach up to the Descemet's membrane, near Descemet's membrane level, although it may not be a true Descemet's membrane that is present. I think I'll show you one movie on this double bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, and this will tell you about the big bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty and the limitations thereof.
Deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty is gradually becoming a technique of choice for corneal transplantation for keratoconus and other anterior stromal corneal pathologies that spare the Descemet's membrane and endothelium. The technique is preferred over penetrating keratoplasty for treating corneal stromal pathologies, as it is an extraocular procedure and has minimal chances of graft rejection. It avoids most complications associated with open sky surgery, and there are lesser chances of post-operative complications such as anterior synecdoche, cataract, or secondary glaucoma. Anwar's technique of air injection to bare the Descemet's membrane is a popular technique due to the advantage of reduced surgical duration and complete baring of the Descemet's. In our experience, the two major problems with big bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty have been the identification of formation and the recognition of an adequate big bubble. Teichmann and Anwar have described signs that help the surgeon ascertain the presence of a big bubble. Firstly, blanching of the corneal stroma spreads in a wave-like circular fashion with the injection of a big bubble. Secondly, a completed bubble frequently exhibits a feathery white band at its circular periphery. Thirdly, the anterior surface of the cornea bulges after the bubble takes up space in the central cornea. In order to make this technique more successful and reproducible, corneal surgeons have proposed some modifications to the standard surgical technique. We describe a new technique of big bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty that allows the surgeon to definitely and immediately identify the formation of an adequate big bubble. A Hesburgh-Barron suction trephine was used to perform partial thickness trephination of the host cornea to an approximate depth of 60 to 70% of the corneal thickness. A self-sealing paracentesis wound was created with a 15-degree surgical blade just posterior to the limbus at 11 o'clock, and some aqueous humor was expressed. Subsequently, a small amount of air of 3 to 4 mm in diameter and 0.08 to 0.1 cc in volume was injected into the anterior chamber. Following this, a 27-gauge needle was advanced horizontally in the corneal stroma, and then air was injected gradually into the stroma to form the big bubble. Air was injected until peripheral movement of the bubble of air injected earlier in the anterior chamber was noted. This dynamic sign allowed us to immediately seize the injection of air into the cornea, as it was indicative of complete formation of the big bubble. Debulking of the anterior 2/3 of the corneal stroma was then done, leaving a thin layer of posterior corneal stroma underneath. A 15-degree blade stained with gentian violet was used to create a shelved opening into the potential space between the Descemet's membrane and the posterior stroma. Entry into this space was easily identified by the dynamic movement of the small bubble from the periphery of the anterior chamber back to the center of the AC. At this point, the incision was immediately discontinued, and 2% hydroxypropyl methyl cellulose was injected through the opening into the potential space to clearly delineate it. A pair of blunt-tipped curved Vanner scissors was used to divide the thin layer of the posterior corneal stroma tissue into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant was subsequently excised, bearing the Descemet's membrane completely. A 0.25 mm oversized donor lenticule was punched from the endothelial side, and its Descemet's membrane was removed after staining with 0.06% trypan blue dye. The donor lenticule was then secured with 16 10-0 monofilament nylon sutures. This technique was attempted in 3 eyes with keratoconus and 1 eye with macular dystrophy. In all these eyes, the big bubble was successfully formed. The dynamic shift of the small bubbles helped us to recognize the adequate formation of the big bubble in all the cases. No intraoperative complications were encountered during any of the steps of the surgery. A best corrected visual acuity of greater than 20/30 was achieved in all the cases. The advantages of our technique include the following. 1. A real-time evaluation of the recognition of the big bubble. That is, as soon as a big bubble is formed, there is a sudden peripheral movement of the air from the center of the AC due to the inward bulging of the Descemet's membrane. Being a dynamic sign, this sudden movement of the small bubble is easily appreciated by the surgeon. If the small bubbles do not move towards the periphery of the AC after the injection of air into the cornea, this indicates that the Descemet's membrane is not bulging into the AC and that the big bubble has not formed. In such situations, a re-injection of air may be performed from a clear part of the cornea with or without first debulking the anterior corneal stroma. Moreover, the immediate recognition of the formation of the big bubble is advantageous as it prevents injection of too much air into the cornea, which may cause perforation of the Descemet's membrane. 2. Another advantage of our technique is that decompression of the AC prior to the injection of the small bubbles allows space for the Descemet's membrane to bulge inward on injection of the big bubble. This reduces the resistance offered by the cornea of an intact eye, allowing the injection of the big bubble of air into the corneal stroma. We believe that our technique of double bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty has the potential to increase the success of standard big bubble deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty in patients with anterior stromal corneal pathologies.
Okay, so if you see the outcomes of the deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, you would have by now known that the perforation rate is high in these cases, because when you inject that air inside the cornea, there are chances that you can perforate the Descemet's membrane. So they range from 4% to 10.5%. And so you may have to convert these cases into a penetrating keratoplasty. The next technique for reinforcing the peripheral part of the cornea is the tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty, which is indicated in large cones which are going towards the periphery in cases which are associated with pellucid marginal degeneration, because that is there in the periphery only. In cases of keratoglobus, where you need to reinforce the entire 360 degrees circumferentially. And sometimes when you do a penetrating keratoplasty or lamellar keratoplasty for keratoconus, you have ectasia actually coming from the periphery, because keratoconus is associated, it is a genetically determined disease. So although you've replaced the central cornea, the peripheral keratocytes are still diseased. So from the periphery of the graft host junction, you can have ectasia coming that, although it is a rare entity, but it is known to be there. And in all these cases, you can do a tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty. The advantage of this technique is that it is a single-stage surgery, and you are at the limbus, and at the limbus you have stem cells, so you don't want to destroy the stem cells. So it preserves the stem cells, and it also gives tectonic support to the corneal periphery, which is most important. Now, this is the technique to highlight the same. In this case, onto the recipient cornea, what is done is a partial thickness trephination is done. And this is followed by the dissection of the anterior part, which could be about 250 to 350 microns. Now, having done this dissection, there is a pocket which is present peripherally all around. So that pocket, with the help of a lamellar dissector, is reinforced 360 degrees all around. This is the donor cornea which is taken, and a small rim of the donor cornea is then cut, which is about 1 to 2 millimeters all around. And this is then placed onto the recipient in such a manner that the peripheral flange that had been created goes actually inside the pocket which had been created before. So it reinforces all around 360 degrees in the periphery. And then the suture is passed in such a manner that it goes from the peripheral flange and it comes out through the pocket that had been previously created. Now this is a case of
200 microns. Two-staged lap.
This is a case in which the again a tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty was done. The anterior lamellar button was dissected off. The pocket was then reinforced because this was a case of keratoglobus, so that is why TILC is being performed here. The full thickness graft is then taken, and the rim or peripheral fringe is created, or the rim 1 to 2 millimeters from the endothelial sides is removed. And AC paracentesis is done because otherwise it is very difficult to suture on a cornea which is so much protruding out. And the peripheral flange is then tucked inside the host 360 degrees all around, so that peripherally now the whole area is reinforced. And this is after the suture removal. You can do this technique either 360 degrees all around, such as in keratoglobus, or if there's a pellucid marginal degeneration where you just need to do it inferiorly or in a localized area, you can just do the tuck-in part only in that particular area. These are some of the results. Notice how the cornea which is protruding out in the side pictures has actually become flattened. In cases where there's significant scarring because of acute hydrops, or where there's an endothelial abnormality which is associated, or if you're not too confident about doing a lamellar keratoplasty, you can do a penetrating keratoplasty, but the quality of the tissue has to be very good. The quality of vision would be better than that of a lamellar graft, and you do not require any extra instruments or machine for this. And this is a case of keratoconus in which a penetrating keratoplasty is being done. This is the Hesburgh-Barron suction trephine which is being used, and the anterior chamber is then entered, and the whole corneal button is removed because it's a full thickness keratoplasty, and a full thickness donor tissue is then punched from the endothelial sides, and the entire cornea is replaced. And this is a technique which can be done in scarred cases. This is the book that we published on DALK, that is deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. And thank you for your attention.
Any questions, comments? I think there should be a high suspicion of for keratoconus. It's a very common problem which we normally miss. Any changing astigmatism should be the warning sign, and we should be aware that there's an entity, and we should actively look for in young adults. And that's when you can catch it early and then try to stop the progression with collagen cross-linking. I think compared to 10-20 years back, we are seeing less and less of advanced keratoconus now. Do you agree, Namrata?
Yeah.
Or it seems that.
As compared to what I think we are catching them young. That is one reason, and also I think because of the popularity of refractive surgery now. So because every patient that you have to do refractive surgery, you want to rule out a keratoconus suspect. So that is why we are probably diagnosing them early.
And also I think we should highlight when collagen cross-link is indicated, because any keratoconus, majority of them tend to cross-link it.
Yeah, so collagen cross-linking actually is the only surgery as of now which probably halts the progression of the progressive corneal steepening. So you should, it is only advised in those cases which are progressive. That is very important. There's no point doing a collagen cross-linking in cases which are non-progressive. So it should be a progressive case, especially if there's an acute eye drops only in one eye and the patient has come with a keratoconus in the other eye. You should always cross-link the fellow eye. And there are various criteria of progression according to the various studies and various investigators, but if it is more than one diopter of astigmatism over a period of 1 year, then it means that it is progressive. Again, like I said, the age of the patient becomes very important. If a patient of keratoconus you see in the age of 40 years, 42 years, it is unlikely to progress. So there's no point doing a cross-linking in those cases.
Especially with refractive surgery becoming very, very common and patients are demanding it, I think all of us have to be aware that keratoconus is one condition where it should be strictly avoided. So that's where it's important. Any questions, comments, please? Yeah. Can somebody pass on the mic?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Do we prefer collagen cross-linking under general anesthesia, or we go for a local anesthesia?
No, we do it under local anesthesia. See, as far as the procedure is concerned, it is hardly anything. All it requires is a lot of patience because it takes 1 hour to do. And you just do the epithelial debridement, which you can do after instilling proparacaine, hydrochloride, 2 to 3 drops. And following epithelial debridement, you need to put riboflavin drops after every 5 minutes for 30 minutes. And followed by the UV radiation. I showed you the machine that comes. So you need to give the radiation for 30 minutes. Now there is another model of accelerated cross-linking which has come up, which is finishing up the whole procedure in 15 minutes time. And actually it takes 1 hour to do, but I think we would be faster with that. General anesthesia is only indicated for I shouldn't say children, but for patients who are a little apprehensive and maybe in the younger age group.
Is there no role of centration like what we are concerned for in general anesthesia or in local comparatively?
Yeah, there are there are rings which are there, and you can actually the person who is doing it can see those rings to see. You have to calibrate the machine first, and then you have to keep it at a particular distance, and then the patient is asked to look in the center. So there are a whole lot of, the whole thing is calibrated to see that it occurs uniformly and in a standard manner.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes?
Last question.
Ma'am, what is form fruste keratoconus and how will you diagnose it?
Form fruste keratoconus is again a subclinical kind of keratoconus, and it is best diagnosed on a corneal topography map. You can do any kind of, you can use a video keratography based system or the Pentachem or the OpScan. They are also picked up very early by the MEI criteria that I showed you. But one has to suspect them. And form fruste keratoconus, again, you wouldn't like to do a refractive surgery in those cases. But they are picked up earliest on the corneal topography pictures. It is hard to clinically diagnose a form fruste keratoconus.
But basically, there's no progression. Yeah.
Post-LASIK? Keratectasia, okay. Sometimes you may have post-LASIK keratectasia. Again, clinically, if you see, you will be on a slit lamp, you will see that there's a LASIK flap which is present. And you would see that there's, again, corneal thinning, protrusion, which is there. On the video keratography, again, there would be features all suggestive of keratoconus. There would be...
Treatment part.
Treatment part is again similar to the primary keratoconus. To stop it, you can do collagen cross-linking, but if a case of post-LASIK ectasia comes, the first thing that we do is refract the patient, and we try to give him or her contact lenses. And if it gets corrected by contact lenses, it is well and good. If not, then you may have to do a keratoplasty in those cases. Again, people have even done intacs post-LASIK ectasia. But the treatment algorithms remains similar to that of primary keratoconus.